John or Peter? Louise.
All right, well, welcome to Journalism with Community at the Center, and thank you for joining us. John, Peter, and I are pleased to have Eve Pearlman with us today, and we hope that you'll like what we're doing to humanize this digital experience. We see each other's faces, we'll get to hear each other's voices. So I'd like to start with a poem. Famous. The river is famous to the fish. The loud voice is famous to silence, which knew it would inherit the earth before anybody said so. The cat sleeping on the fence is famous to the birds, watching him from the birdhouse. The tear is famous, briefly, to the cheek. The idea you carry close to your bosom is famous to your bosom. The boot is famous to the earth, more famous than the dress shoe, which is famous only to floors. The bent photograph is famous to the one who carries it, and not at all famous to the one who is pictured. I want to be famous to shuffling men who smile while crossing streets. Sticky children in grocery lines, famous as the one who smiled back. I want to be famous in the way a pulley is famous, or a buttonhole, not because it did anything spectacular, but because it never forgot what it could do. So let's find out who else is here. We're going to break into small groups for a short conversation. So what we'd like you to do is please introduce yourself and say a word or two about what struck you about the poem and why you showed up for today's conversation. So you'll have 5 minutes, and then you'll see a notice to come back to the room. So Darren is operating the controls here and is going to break us all into small groups.
Thank you for that, Maggie. For John and Peter and Eve, you may get a notification to go into a breakout room. Do not accept that. But for the rest of you, you're going to get an invitation. Accept that invitation to the breakout room. And for 5 minutes, what struck you about that conversation?
All right. Ron King hasn't gone anywhere, or Greg.
So people will start to jump into their breakout rooms. But Peter, what struck you for that poem?
I want to hear it 10 more times. I love that poem. I just thought it was beautiful that it gave me a way for me to be somebody by just being a buttonhole. I thought it was just stunning. And I thought Maggie said it with such feeling that I was blown away by it.
John?
Well, I like the buttonhole example, especially the utility of the common understanding of what makes us famous.
That's good. Eve, did anything strike you in it?
I like Peter, I'd like to listen to it again, but I got stuck just thinking about the first line, because I think so much about perspective and how what we can, the river is famous to the fish and how we see what we swim in and how we are, just how everything looks so differently from wherever we happen to be.
Alrighty.
How about you, Darren?
I couldn't hear a single word of it simply because I was utterly distracted about getting 15 breakout rooms going. So that's the reality.
Are the names we're seeing still with us?
Say that again?
They're probably phoning in, maybe, because they don't have pictures.
Yeah.
Kim LaCourse, and who is that?
if any of them would like to say something now, can they unmute and say it?
They can. Yep.
So Kevin, Angela, Patricia, Kim, you're doomed to be in a breakout room with us. If you'd like to say something, unmute, even if you want to say that you have nothing to say.
Hi, this is Angela. I'm just really honored to be with you all. My breakout room was empty, so I came back, and I think some of my people are here.
Okay.
Good.
Thanks, Angela. Thanks for coming. Anybody else like to say something? Patricia? Or 206-948-0432? I also thought the poem, fish have an interesting relationship with water, and they don't know what it is. And I thought that was a very powerful way to begin.
Great. Everyone will be back with us here in 3 seconds.
Okay, I have 3 more thoughts I'd like to share. Oh, never mind.
I think the water is to a fish as culture is to us.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well said. Good.
Well, at this point, I'd like to thank Greg Jarrow for contributing that poem. That was really nice. So welcome back, everybody, and I hope you enjoyed that time together, and you'll have another chance to be with your small group after Eve, John, and Peter have talked for a bit. And then at the end of the hour, we're going to try something new as part of our humanizing this digital experience, and that is to leave small groups open for you to come back at the end of the hour if you'd like to spend more time together. So before turning it over, what we'd like to do is introduce you to the team behind the scenes, and you've already met Darren, and we also have Leslie Stephen and Charles Holmes. So there you'll be seeing their names in the chat. Leslie, Darren, and Charles are all part of Abundant Community and the Common Good Collective. So there are ways that we would like you to be engaged other than small groups, and we want you to participate. So if you take a look at the chat, you'll see at the bottom of your screen. If you open the chat window, well, right now you're going to see I'm seeing the poem, but Leslie is adding the how you can participate. So the chat is one way, and we'd like you to do a chat to everyone. That's an option you would have in the drop down. So you can post questions, comments, links as we go along. The mute button is on your screen. Darren can control that also, but if you're aware of noise going on in the background and you're not muted, if you could please mute. And then if you'd like to speak, raise your hand. Let us know in some way, either in the chat or raising your hand that you'd like to be recognized. So now I'm going to turn it over to Peter.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I have my thing on speaker view, so if you want to see a whole screen of who's talking, you can do that, or you can keep it on gallery view. Eve is our guest today, and I'm thrilled about that, because Eve is, I read an article, but the New York Times now dominates journalism. They have more subscribers than the next 10 people included. They have 1,700 full-time journalists, and there's only 20,000 left in the country. And so something has changed, and Eve is in the center of that transformation that she has, and she'll be talking about that. But I just think that, if journalism is the narrative keeper, if they tell the story of who we are, then there's great room and opportunity for new possibilities. Because the existence, if I let the news, at least the national news, tell me who I am, I need some real help quickly. And no wonder isolation, no wonder in Great Britain they have a minister of loneliness. I don't know whether it's to promote it or to solve it. But I think, Eve, it's so good to have you here. And one of the things, Eve, represents many things, too much for one program, is your commitment to create a structure to help people who from a distance seem unable to come together, and to bring them together in a very special way. So maybe anything more you'd like to say about what you're up to in the world? All right. And then maybe we could start with a specific of the ways you're bringing people together, which has not been journalism's tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And then later we can talk general questions about journalism. So welcome, Eve. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Hey, thank you, Peter, for that kind introduction. I really appreciate it. So I am a journalist. I've been a journalist my whole career, mostly providing local news for a town in California of about 80,000, Alameda, in the Bay Area. And in 2016, as I watched the rising polarization and deep divisions in our society, these growing divides, I really started thinking about my own journalistic practice. I'd always been driven by serving community, informing community, reflecting a positive vision of the community back to itself. But I really started thinking about how I might take a more active, intentional role in bridging and bringing people together in creating real understanding. And I also started thinking about how I do news itself, like instead of starting from an idea in my head, like I think this is the story, I think this is what should be written about. I wanted to really listen more intentionally and carefully to community, and specifically divided communities. And so I launched this method with a co-founder, what we now call dialogue journalism, to think about how to go to places where people aren't talking or talking productively and use our journalistic skills to bring them together in conversation. And so we have a methodology, it's 7 steps, you can see it on our website, but in a nutshell, what we do is identify communities where people aren't talking or talking productively. Our first project was a pilot between cops and students of color in my town. And then to invite them to begin to think about each other as people. So we ask a set of questions. What do you think they think about you? What do you want to know about them? And a few others. And we begin to sort of invite curiosity and humanity into the process. And then we bring them together in a moderated conversation. And instead of reporting, again, from what we think, we use that conversation as a place to use our reporting. What do people need to know to understand each other better? And then we work with ourselves and other news organizations to tell stories out of those conversations. So there's a lot embedded in this process. It's slowing down, it's seeing each other as people, it's thinking about service first, it's putting community at the heart of our practice. But the idea is really how can we very intentionally meet the information needs and social needs of community. It's been a joy to do this work and to feel in community with lots of people doing bridging and dialogue work in other disciplines.
You have them in the room together at one time?
We started, we've done it different ways. Like with cops and students of color, that project, we had them separate because the power imbalance is so profound there. We had a reporter ferrying back questions. So the students would be like, is the cop who stops me and my friend the same guy who goes to a shootout? Or what weapons do you carry? And the cops had questions like, have you ever interacted with a police officer, or is all your interaction on, through what you see on digital spaces? So in that case, we kept them apart. In other cases, we've combined in-person meeting with online meetings. We've worked a lot digitally. We did a big project that brought Trump supporters from Alabama together in conversation with Clinton supporters in the Bay Area. That was all on Facebook. So we've done bunches of different things, and I'm a believer that you can do really beautiful things not in person, as well as in person.
So when the cops answered a question, how did the young people find out what their answer was?
So in that case, we had a reporter going back, like, here's the students' questions, here's the cops' questions, going back and forth and presenting that information. And what was interesting about it is that is how much profound ignorance there was, and also how much sensitivity on both sides, right? The cops are trying to do their job in a very difficult environment, and they're a flashpoint for our society for lots of good reasons. And so there's a lot of vulnerability on both sides. So we're really interested in creating space for that sincerity.
And how then would a journalist, listening to the interplay of these two viewpoints,
Yeah.
what would they draw from it? Now I am going to be the consumer of the journalist who's there. What is the journalist going to tell me about that? Is they going to tell me what each side said, or are they going to talk about it in conflict terms? How does this get used?
Yeah, we talk about it in two ways. One, we think about reporting to meet the needs of the conversation, right? So if the conversation is about, say it's a conversation about guns and it's about bump stocks, then we can actually provide information about bump stocks. So at least there's a shared set of facts. So we report into the conversation so that people can talk about what matters to them. And then we report out of the conversation to larger audience. So maybe there's a reporting that's about a fact stack in a conversation, but then our partner news organizations can write about that more broadly. We also think that it's newsworthy that these conversations are happening, right? It's newsworthy that people can, in fact, when given space and support, talk about really difficult issues together. And so that has been, if you look at the story that's come out of our work, some of it is that, like, look, they actually did it. And then look, they learned from each other. And I will say that it's really important to remember that our work isn't about changing minds. It's really based in the idea that just the act of being able to talk respectfully to one another is incredibly vital on, myriad levels for our democracy, for our humanity. And so that's where we focus our efforts.
When I think about newspapers, at least, I think one of their useful activities is to provide me facts.
Yep.
In this kind of a discussion that you're talking about, where do facts come in the discussion, or do they? I'm wondering whether or not the main thing is not that they don't have information about each other, it's that they don't trust each other. And if that's the case, what's your experience in trust building in that process?
Yeah, that's a huge part of this. And because we're working from a place where so many people don't know what to trust, don't know how to trust. And for us, a core belief is that relationships come before trust, right? They precede it. And we know this in our personal lives. We don't trust someone implicitly. We trust them because they've earned it. And so part of what we're doing when we bring people together, we sometimes think of a triangle of trust between divided communities and journalism. And by showing up, by being real, by being authentic, by doing very explicitly making our work for community, not for us, for our ego, for our byline, for our clicks, it builds trust. And so one of the really beautiful things that's come out of this work is we find that when we report into conversation, people believe us because we've come forth with as much honesty and integrity and openness as we can. And so this is an exercise in trust building, and it's embedded in every piece of our work.
And what do you think what are the key factors that lead to trust that you do as a journalist?
Yeah, and this, throughout my career as a journalist, I've worked hard to be transparent, to be authentic, to be real. Like, I live in a community, so if I'm out and about and someone says, hey, I saw you did this, you wrote this, it's not exactly right, my response is, okay, why? What did I miss? How can I do better? And I also have always worked, and especially in my work with Spaceship, to just show up as a full person. I'm not pretending I don't have views. I'm not pretending I don't have biases. I'm not pretending I'm not firmly rooted in my life experience. And coming to people that way, as you all know, builds better relationships. And so that's a core piece of all of this.
One other thing I was noticing is you said when you get people together, discussion from the polls, you don't want them to be avatars. You want them to come as individuals, not with any kind of categorical identity. Why?
Well, because that's how people want to be known, right? I mean, that's an interesting question. No one's ever asked me that. I don't want to be known as a left-leaning liberal woman from the Bay Area. I want to be known as the complexity of my nature. And so asking people to be real and authentic is very helpful. And also we find that people's views are much more nuanced when you give them a little space to slow down. You know, one of the beautiful things that happens in every conversation we do is people start to say, well, I'm basically this, but in these ways, I am different than others. And so we see it invites texture and reality instead of, you know, these beaten down talking points that you hear on either side.
Good. Peter.
I feel the same joy and relief listening to you and what you're saying, John and Eve, as I did from the poem. I'm thinking, you know, what you said was, we're not here for ego, bylines, and clicks. And that's a radical stance, because most of the belief system of the dominant. And the fact that you are committed as a journalist to see the nuances of identity, stance, beliefs is such a radical, you know, you call it dialogue or relationship. To me, that's quite amazing. Because as soon as we finish this, as soon as I pick up a paper, I'm going to see something very different than that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't care what that paper is called, left, right, center, etc. And the fact you've created somewhat of a business out of this means there's an audience for this. And you're kind of claiming as your own identity of a journalist, space that people who did facilitation used to claim. And I just, it's so interesting. Where's this, what's next? Suppose somebody came to you and said, money, no object.
Oh, I wish they would say that.
Well, I'm saying that money's no object. Okay, I am an avatar. I can't deliver on my promise. Where would you take this? Where's the next generation of this kind of mindset that you're living?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. First, I wanted to say that, just to respond to something you said, I feel like the work is resonant because there is such a deep hunger in our society for something real, right? We are so desperately in need of, and you all know this, right? Like in connection and slowing things down and being human with another. But if money were no object, you know, I come out of local news, and local news has been so profoundly decimated in our across the world for lots of reasons, because of the change in tech, because of the changing economics. But so I'm interested in what I'm piloting right now are these local journalism pilots. So we think about community conversation in my town of Alameda becoming a place for conversation and reporting out of that. So taking this concept of conversation-driven news cycle into local news spaces. We've mostly done topic-specific things like immigration, guns, electoral politics, policing, right? But I'm interested in, can we take this model of listening first, of holding community, and use it in local spaces? So I've got a couple pilots going with that. Because we need, without the texture of an intimacy of local journalism, we really lose stuff. And your point at the top about New York Times is dominating right now. But for example, I live on the West Coast, and when the way the West Coast is covered by New York journalists is just, it's not quite right, because they're not here. They know it's different, right? And so all that intimacy of local really matters. And lots of people in the journalism space are working on models to how to rebuild this. Is it a nonprofit model? Is it a membership model? Is it, how do we do it digitally and in other ways in this changing world?
It seems to me, and you're right, you know, the map of New York City, you know, is the whole thing, and there's a little sliver called West Coast.
Yeah.
But what I got from you is not only bringing people together, but you know how to report it out. And it seems to me that there's a world of important local neighborly things happening.
Yeah.
That we're starting something called the Common Good Collective, which is to try to create a discipline out of being able to get citizens engaged with each other about things that matter to make their life better. But then when you say you know how to report it out, that's so missing right now.
Yeah, I mean,
Say more about reporting out and what that means to you.
Well, I'm not. Well, I'm going to jump a little, and then you'll tell me if this answers your question or not. But
Anyway.
when I think about old school local news, like the town I live in used to have 9 reporters, right, and had a daily newspaper, and those reporters told stories about schools, and they told stories about City Hall, but they also told stories about births and deaths and marriages and accomplishments, and so the community could see itself as human, right? Instead of, you know, my neighbor might be ideologically different than me or be supporting a different candidate, but I know that they're human. I'm keenly aware of it. I'm reminded of it. And so our shared fate and our shared humanity was more often reflected in our publications. And so that has gotten stripped down and stripped away. And so some of what I want to rebuild is that just the texture and the fabric of daily life. I don't know if that was an adjacent answer to your question or your.
No, it's a wonderful response to my question. I remember talking to the mayor and his father once, and I was thinking of starting a local news thing. And his father said, "There's only one job I want." And I said, "What's that?" He says, "I want to be the one who decides what is news." And to me, what you're doing is redefining. Right now, we think big boxes are the only place that news resides. Big bangs, conflict, violence. You're going to change that. You're going to say for us to find our humanity, be a true common good collective. We have to get off this notion that only people in power are doing things that matter. And that's truly beautiful about what you're doing and saying. And you're developing the methodology for that. You've crossed the virtual line. You say you don't need them in the room together. All you need is somebody, you needed to build trust through the things that you're doing. I just think that's pretty amazing. You're redefining what constitutes news, and you're developing vehicles to do that. And it is about local.
It is about local. I mean, one of the ways we think about it is what is the information people need to live their lives, right?
Yeah. Say that again slowly.
We think about what is the information people need to live their lives, right? So,
that's a great question. Wait a second. Don't rush. Say it one more time.
We think a lot about what is the information that people need to live their lives. So like right now with coronavirus, right? People need really clear advice about what they can do, what they should do, what's happening in their communities. And that I'm in the Bay Area, we now have cases. There's so little, the infrastructure of the major news organizations in this region are so pared down that people don't know. And so they're looking in all kinds of places, and it's very scattered and it's difficult. And so having community where that's discussed, where we report in response to what people are asking, you know, somebody's like, where do I get alcohol? How is this transmitted? How many cases are there in town? All of that information is what people need right now in this particular community. And that's how we think about it. Not, you know, the big headlines that alarm.
Not its impact on the stock market. Yeah.
Eve, let me ask, I'm trying to imagine a discussion.
Yeah.
You have people on the polls, let's say about immigration.
Yeah.
You had that.
Yeah.
And you got a couple of journalists there.
Yeah.
They're learning something that they probably have not learned before at that personal level.
Yeah.
And now they're ready to write a story. What I'm having a little problem with my imagination is, what are they reporting out? Finally, the outcome of this is something that they're writing about an event that is very unusual, where people are talking across polls.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So we did a big conversation about immigration in California, and just for an example, one of the stories that came out of that was, at one point in the group, everybody started that was a tough conversation. Like feelings are very high and very intense, right? So we're working really hard. But at one point, the group started talking about their own immigration plan, like what they would do if they were in charge, like what laws they would put in place, how they would manage it. And it was a very heartfelt, it was on Facebook, conversation, and people really thinking in detail about what to them made sense from their vantage point. And so and the reporter ended up doing a story about that conversation. And then a little like Facebook Live thing came out of that too. So two of the people who were most involved with that talked about their plans. So that's just an example of the kind of thing. It's varied a lot. In the guns conversation we did, a lot of stories came out about points of connection, points of people recognizing each other even across, these wide divides in belief systems and practice. So does that help give texture to it a little bit?
Right. Another thing I wonder is, it has seemed to me that people are more likely, if they're face to face, to come to some kind of reconciliation than they are, for instance, in this kind of a medium, electronic world, or in any other kind of position where they are representative of something, right? So I'm wondering whether you see that the very act of being together in a relatively familiar small space is itself an important part of what makes for more communication.
Yeah. So I believe that really beautiful things can happen in digital spaces, and I've seen it, and I think it's very easy. There's I believe, first of all, that there's no substitute for being in the same room as someone. It's a different experience. But I also think that there are remarkable, beautiful, extraordinary connections that happen in digital spaces online. And I think and there's some elements of digital communication that you don't have in face-to-face. You can take a break, you can pause, you can type, and you can delete. You can walk away for an hour or a day. And so our conversations are generally over a month. And so you get a chance to go in and come out. You can, and there's something, constraints are often very empowering. And so there's the constraint of you can't see each other. You're removing all the things, the richness of in-person communication. But there's opportunity there. And if you look at all the tremendous affinity groups online, for example, around all kinds of issues, around every disease discussion, every transition of life discussion, there's so much richness and intimacy. You can find people all around the world who have very similar experiences. And in our case, you can find people who have really different views, but who have some structure around how they engage. So we say we're platform agnostic. I think there's value in digital communication. There's value in in-person communication. They're really different. As I think a lot of introverted people thrive in digital spaces. I think a lot, so I think there's just lots of ways to connect, and they're all really valuable.
I would just say, because we're going to break in a minute, two things. One is you're kind of changing my thinking about the advantages of distance. There's time for reflection, asynchronous life. You're saying there's learning advantages, there's peacemaking advantages. I thank you for that. The other thing that's powerful is in the reporting. You are saying that citizens have their own expertise, and that you as a reporter would find it interesting, and maybe more interesting, to have citizen solutions as to what they would do with immigration, where part of the centralization and the end of democracy is the belief that only a few people know, and they're the ones. So it's really such a humanistic and citizen-based thinking that you have. And for journalists to believe that, I'd love to know what they're teaching in journalism schools these days. And but I'm not asking that. Is it time for us to break? Let me ask a higher power. Does anybody have an answer to that question?
It is, well, I'm not a higher power, but I think it's 10:35 on that.
It is, Peter. Could you kind of give us a sense of what's something that we could wrestle with in the breakout room?
One question would be, if you believed everything she said, how would that change the way you think about what you're doing in your own neighborhood? If she was right, if it was true, what's the transformation in you that would flow out of having heard Eve for 14 minutes? That's my best shot at a mediocre question, but what the hell? So are you breaking us up now?
So we thought we'd have about 10 minutes to break into the small groups, and which Darren will do. And I think if someone could write down Peter's question in the chat, that may be helpful. So Darren's going to break us up, and we'll come back in 10 minutes.
Alrighty, Charles, and we're on Facebook Live, so this is kind of the main group for a breakout session for the Facebook Live audience. So I'm going to continue to play technical support, and I'm going to get out of the way so that you guys can continue having a conversation.
And Darren, I was in a breakout earlier with one person. Do we know that he's gone into another group?
That is correct.
Okay.
David is still with us. That's nice. Hi, David.
Pardon for a minute.
So, Eve, let me ask you a question.
I'm looking, there's a bunch of questions in the chat, but I don't know how you guys want to manage those.
Well, if you want to respond to those later, you can.
Okay.
I'm just thinking, how is this going for you? What's shifting in you as a result of being in this conversation right now?
Oh, for me, I love talking about this work. It always makes me really happy to reflect on it, and I always like it when people ask questions that I haven't answered exactly that way. Like John asked a couple questions that I hadn't had framed that way, so it makes me think. So I just like doing what I do a lot.
You know, I'm curious. I mean, what you're bringing up is the power. Responding to is the power of questions. You know, and John and Peter. I mean, the beauty, the power of the questions that you ask. And I'd just be really curious, you know, either Eve or John or Peter, to hear. I just get a little bit inside your brain around where those questions arise from.
I think I tend to ask practice questions, right? And it's because that's where I've spent most of my life, right? And so it generates from being with people at a very local level, right? And I know people leave a room, but always they're saying to themselves, what can I do with this? If I would always hope that when people leave, they would have two things happen: some shift in their thinking and some idea of what to do. Those two things.
I guess if I were going to pitch to answer that kind of question, John, it would be to, I have a lot of things I say to journalists, but to non-journalists, I would invite empathy for journalists. As you read their work and watch their work, it's a hard job, and it's a hard job because of the time constraints. It's a hard job because it's every time you make a piece of content, it's a creative act, even though there's a structure and a formula. It's you're making something from a whole bunch of stuff. And there are so many business pressures and social pressures. And so it's a beautiful job, but it's a difficult job. And so that would be my takeaway.
You know, Eve, what you're speaking to, I think, connects a little bit to one of the question that David Guthrow brought into the chat, and that's this overcoming the fear of bias.
Yeah.
You know, and his comment, people are primed to look for spin in spite of declared intent.
Right.
As was mentioned earlier, the number of journalists is decreasing almost as rapidly as the increase in PR professionals. So I think his question is such a powerful and important one in the context of this conversation about questions, but also about this fears of bias.
You know, I think it's possible to be biased and live with an open heart and an open mind. You know, I like the notion for every great idea, the opposite idea is also true. And that, I think that's so much what you embody. You know, it's interesting, your question about questions. John's is one of practicality. I've never been burdened.
That's why we're a good pair.
Never worried about what I was going to do. I always cared only about purpose. What was the point?
Yeah.
And I always felt if I knew the point in this moment, I would know what to do.
Yeah.
And I think they're both true. You know, you can't care about ideas without action. You can't care about action if you haven't had time to think, because otherwise half the stuff I do is habit. And
Eve, just another thing I just wondered about is you can imagine that there are newspapers that have a tilt, and certainly the cable news has a tilt. And that framework of understanding is an argument about ideas. But Trump comes into the picture, and he erases the idea that there are competing different ideas. And he says the other side is fake.
Right.
We're going to erase it. There is no argument over there. It's fake news. And I think it's been very powerful for his constituency. And I wonder if you have thoughts about that dilemma.
Yeah.
There's no argument you can make. You're just fake.
Before I do that, John, I wanted to Charles, your question about you highlighted David's question about fear of bias, and and that is a much bigger question, as is yours, John. But for me, I think a lot about being transparent and being authentic. So not the way I do my journalism is to not. And I was a columnist for a long time, so it fed to this, but it's not to pretend that I don't carry views, that I don't carry bias, and to be really open to the feedback from community. So when we report into conversation, when people say, hey, why did you choose this source? Or, hey, this smacks of bias to me, we work very hard to engage that authentically and to acknowledge our own perspectives and bias. So that transparency is fundamental to that. And that's the whole objectivity in journalism is a whole kettle of fish or whatever, barrel of worms, or I don't know, but the whole thing onto itself. But back to your question about Trump, there's a huge journalism is really struggling with how to manage an overt liar and a manipulator, and the traditional frame of saying person X said, one person on one side said this, the person on the other side said this, doesn't work. Is Trump has figured out how to destroy that. And so there's a lot of work and thinking in journalism of how to reckon with that. And it goes against a lot of people's habits of practice to just simply say, he said this, it's a lie, because for a whole lot of reasons. And so that it is really difficult to break practice, but a lot of people are working very hard. And one of the ways through is something called Citizen Agenda, which you guys could look up, which is to start from what are the policy and platform issues of candidates? Like, what are they actually doing? What is it? How does it impact people's lives? What do they stand for versus the horse race, Twitter coverage kind of thing that we have. And so there's a real pushback in journalism to think about how to deal with that. And it cracked, it's very clear, he's cracked open the failings of how we have done this work. And there's a lot of
stop for a second. We've got a little section here, I think, to listen to what happened in the groups. If anybody would like to say something, I think you physically have to raise your hand, I guess, or unmute, Darren, and claim your space. It's like you can choose to be born all on your own. Will, are you unmuted?
I did. Yeah. So my question would be, gladly. So my question is, how do you deal with the want to questions? So when you've got these groups, so maybe it's individuals and then police officers, and you want to bring them together, how do you deal with the motivation to bring them together? What are some best practices there?
What do you mean the motivation? Like, how do you?
Like if you wanted to create a conversation between two groups that were maybe at conflict with each other, how do you bring them together? Beyond the mechanics of creating the journalism, how do you actually make them want to talk to each other?
Yeah, well, we don't make people do things, but what we always do in every start of every project is to post a call out with usually our partner news organizations. So it's, are you interested in a fact-based, respectful conversation about issue X? So that calls out some people, right? Some people are like, I don't actually want to talk to them. And then we do an intake survey and ask a bunch of questions. And if people come in and they're like full of expletives and explain why the other side is terrible and horrible, we don't invite them into the conversation. So it is a certain percentage of the population that is willing to do this, but we don't need everyone. We're just interested in bringing some people together. And some people, like I've had people sign up for a conversation and then be like, actually, I can't talk to them. I feel too personally threatened, too angry, too frustrated. I don't want to talk to them.
Thank you, Will. Other people like to make a statement, ask a question. All you have to do is raise your hand, unmute. David, you're on.
Okay. This is great, and some things flow out of a conversation that I had last week. It was a conversation about hope and why we have hope about changing things, making the world a better place, etc. And the person said that the only thing that is holding them back is sort of the crisis of trust that we're in, and sort of moved into talking about journalism. And so I was quite interested, even the things that you were saying about trust and the intimacy of local journalism. The idea that there was a time when our local communication was local enough that we could trust it because we knew something about it. We were participants in it. When the local newspaper came out, I knew that story was true because I knew some of the people in the story, for example, and all of that. And so I'm in Canada, by the way. All of that has disappeared, and so. Sorry?
Stop bragging. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Well, also your accent gave you away.
Okay. If I was bragging, I wouldn't be in this conversation today. So plenty of work to do up here too. But I think there's some really interesting pieces here about that whole local piece and building trust. And I just really like the way that you're bringing people together and that triangle of trust for journalism. I got to go and talk to some of the journalists I know soon.
Thank you very much, David. We got another David now. Yeah.
Just so for what it's worth, I was doing some work with a group of NGOs, international NGOs, as well as folks from the extractive industry, so mining, oil and gas, and things like that. And they actually wanted to explore each other's opinions on working in developing countries. And they used something that I hadn't heard of before, but you probably have, Chatham House rule, which from a journalistic perspective, everything was recorded and reported, but not attributed. Because people were really concerned about what happens if someone hears me actually agreeing with something that was said on the other side. And so there's getting people together in the room, but also trusting the journalist who's pulling it together, that they will be as devoid of bias as possible. And if there's concern about that, being able to report it out in a way that everyone can hear it, but not under sort of the veil of fear about the judgment that might be heaped upon them.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because we have the way we deal with, like, say it's a Facebook conversation of 100 people talking. Our rules, our guidelines are that we won't share anything you say in this group or anything without your explicit permission. So we treat it as an off the record community. And what we find is that people, so we very explicitly ask to quote or to use a story or to use anything from the group. And that's important because of this idea of the way journalism has so many times been so extractive and harmful to people. And so that's a part of our process. It's not Chatham House rules, but it's, your voices, this is private, this is off the record, unless you say otherwise.
Thank you. Margaret, you're unmuted. Does that mean you might want to say something? Oh, she's not unmuted. I just saw you weren't muted. I thought that would mean something, but it didn't. Other
Ron had his hand up.
Yeah.
Yeah. In response to John's question about trust, I think we do an adequate job of that by using storytelling. So that around the big issues, we have an organization called Sidebar Stories. So we invite the community to come in and create their own sidebar stories to the major issues around us. And we teach a very simple story map that they can use to develop their story. But then your point, Peter, on how does it get out there, we don't know how to do yet. We've brought in local artists, musicians, and writers to take some of these stories and turn them into original music, visual art through storyboards, and narrative writing, and put it on stage. But we're looking for a better way to get more of these stories out attached to the big story, because every sidebar story is attached to some general social issue, and we don't have a connection to help people feel like their stories are really being heard.
I think that's a beautiful statement, Ron. There's so many people doing so many amazing things, and yet we don't know there is a journalist waiting for us. And that Eve knows how to do that, and she doesn't have to draw a crowd every time. She doesn't have to manage 300 people. She doesn't have to do that. And that's the two of you, something comes together when the two of you are connected. So thank you, Ron. Beautiful. Yeah, Larry, unmute.
Yes, thank you.
Tell us
Eve,
where you are.
oh, I'm in Kentucky, just a few miles from downtown Cincinnati.
Good, we're neighbors.
And yes,
we know each other, actually. Go ahead, Larry.
I hope to know you better, Peter. I love this work. So my question is, Eve, has anyone borrowed this idea and used it successfully in other communities? Or have you written it up so that people could borrow it? I'm working with a nonprofit in Kentucky that's trying to get schools, public schools, to engage more deeply and thoroughly with their communities and with their parents. And we have already started some workshops along those lines. But this sounds like it could either contribute or add to it in some way.
Thank you for that question, Larry. So for me, the interest is in supporting this work in as much as possible and making it live in the world. So on our website, you can download a toolkit. It's long, it's 80 pages, but it really maps out what we do, why, and how. And there's a whole lot of news articles. It's free. There's a whole lot of news articles too, but I'm also happy to talk to you about it. For me, the way these projects are run is they're large and demanding, but I think there's lots of ways to take bits and pieces of this work and and I talk to journalists all the time who are doing similar things or taking some of the thinking or taking some of the practice into their own work. So I invite you to do that. I invite everyone to do that. I'm happy to chat with anyone who has questions about how they might set something up or how they might learn from what we've been doing. I think there's so many ways to iterate on community connection and relationship building, both in the journalistic space and outside. There's also a great organization, the Bridge Alliance, which is a collection of organizations doing bridging work, not in the journalism space, but there's just so many organizations that have been doing this kind of work for a long time, and then lots of new ones that have come up. Spaceship Media is the only one that I'm keenly aware of that is, and I've been looking, that really is in the journalism space, doing bridging, thinking about community in this way.
So thank you very much. Thanks, Larry. So I think we want to, we're at the 55-minute mark. Two things. One is, before we get final comments, as I mentioned before, we're starting this Common Good Collective. And the idea is to treat order and a discipline about people that are trying to build communities in a particular way, which is to give citizens more control over their own well-being. And part of this is a departing of the consumer culture, which means citizens' well-being is dependent on what they can purchase. And you see in this campaign season, basically it's a marketing campaign, and I'm treated like a customer, not a producer of my own future. And so it's called Common Good Collective. We want you to be a part of it. I think doing this kind of thing and the work that Eve is doing, and I've always felt that the journalism piece was essential to the common good. And it should be news, not a human interest story. And most of the people that cover your work call it human interest story. In fact, they let you write about it. They say, well, you write it and we'll publish it. Whereas what Eve represents, I think, is a journalism that says what you are doing is news. And the Common Good Collective wants to make that explicit and make it easy for us to come together and learn from each other how to do this, so it becomes a collective of shared expertise and wisdom, and not an academic kind of expert-based methodology. So join us. And I would like to, any final thoughts you have, John or Eve, about today, our conversation, and then stick around because we're going to keep the space open for you. So if you want to, they're going to break small groups again, so you can continue the conversation after we kind of get final reflections from Eve and John.
Well, let me make a plug at the website of the organization that I was a co-founder. It's abcdinstitute.org. And if you go there and look under publications, you'll see one called Neighborhoods and Newspapers. And I think it's a very useful and applied way for local people to engage and become themselves actors in terms of the world of information. I think it's free too. You can download it.
Eve, thank you so much for not only being here, but enjoying being here. You know, anything you'd like to say about this conversation or reflections on for the group that showed up?
No, just thank you so much for having me and letting me be a part. And just want to reiterate that there's a free, there's a resource on my site. I said this during the breakout, but I want to say it again and emphasize it, which is if there's a takeaway, John had asked about takeaways, I think it's to, as you look at news, to have empathy for that reporter, that journalist who's working hard to do this work in a kind of in a complex and difficult and demanding landscape. But also, I want to add to that, don't be afraid to communicate with journalists in the way that you, of course, would like to be communicated with. Like if you see reporting that is framed in a way that you see as problematic, or if you see things that aren't accurate, like help journalists, help them serve the community better. And I think that's hard to do in this landscape, but it's worth trying, because providing feedback and valuable information in a respectful way is an important piece of all of this.
Journalists have their own sense of isolation. I also think reaching out.
Yeah.
The journalists, you are part of our community. Thank you. And thank you, Eve, so much. So Maggie, you want to pitch the final thing?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Eve, Peter, John, team behind the scenes. Just want to say our next conversation will be on Monday, April 27, and we will have Al Admansky as our guest. And also please check out commongood.cc for other ways to stay engaged. Sign up to receive our reader and our podcasts. And don't forget abundantcommunity.com. So we look forward to seeing you next time. So now Darren will open us up to small groups. Is that what the plan is? And that'll be on for about 15 minutes or so if you'd like to hang out. So thanks for joining us.